I don't know when I'm going to release this, but in any case, the new year started on a depressing note for me. The philosopher Derek Parfit died yesterday. As many of you know, he is someone who I often refer to as a genius. He was just one of the most brilliant people. I never met him, unfortunately, and in the last few months I had been exchanging emails with him, initially trying to get him on the podcast, and when that failed, trying to get him to do a written Q&A for me on my blog, which he agreed to do, but had many irons in the fire and many complications in his life, including health ones. And at a certain point, I decided to no longer remind him that he had agreed to do this. And now I'm left with the strange feeling of having tried to claim some of the great man's time when he was quickly running out of it. So, in any case, read his books, in particular, the book upon which he made his name, Reasons and Persons. Just an astonishing, luminous, and deeply strange work. If any work of philosophy seems like it could have been written by a Martian, and a very wise one at that, it's that book. That's all I'm thinking about at the moment. Surely I have something else to announce, but it can wait until the next podcast. Today I am speaking with Lawrence Wright. Lawrence is a journalist and an author and a screenwriter and a playwright. He is very well known as a staff writer for the New Yorker magazine, and he has written many works of nonfiction, a book called Remembering Satan, The Looming Tower, for which he won the Pulitzer Prize, Going Clear, the revelatory work about Scientology that was made into a documentary, 13 Days in September, and his most recent book is The Terror Years, which is a compilation of all his writing on Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State that he did for the New Yorker. So needless to say, our interests on a variety of topics here overlap. I've never met Lawrence. I've never gotten a chance to speak with him before, so it was great to have an excuse to do it. That's one of the amazing things about having this podcast as a forum. I can send someone I admire an email, ask them if they want to have a conversation. Sometimes they do, and you get to hear it. So, without further ado, I introduce you to the great Lawrence Wright. I have Lawrence Wright on the line. Lawrence, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Good to talk to you, Sam.
So, I will have introduced you before we got on here, but tell people how you describe yourself. Do you think of yourself as a journalist first, or are you an author more generally? How do you think of yourself?
I guess I think of myself as a writer. I write, in addition to journalism, I write plays and movies, and I've written a novel. So I like experimenting with different forms.
Yeah, well, that's actually one of the things I most admire about what you're doing. I mean, I'm a huge fan of your work, but the quality of the work aside, I love the way you use so many different platforms to communicate your ideas. It often starts with a New Yorker article, but your articles often become books, and some of these books become documentaries, and one became a stage play and then became a documentary. And so it's very creative, and you're like the king of media at this point. It's very cool to see.
I thanks for that, but mainly I think the hardest thing as a writer is finding the ideas that you want to write about. And there's such a paucity of ideas that you want to devote your life to. And so when I hit on something that I'm really intrigued by, then I sometimes try to work it into different forms.
Well, is there a primary concern or set of ideas that unifies all of your work? I mean, how do you decide what sorts of topics to address?
You know, it's very intuitive, but now that I'm older, I look back and I see that I've had a lifelong interest in religion and why people believe one thing rather than another. It seems to be a thread that goes through much of my work.
I was thinking along those lines myself. It seems to me that you and I share a common interest in the power of belief, and in particular the power of bad beliefs, bad ideas that become ascendant in some context or another. And we'll get into specifically these different topics, but you spent a lot of time thinking about Islamic extremism and Scientology and other cult-like phenomenon like Jonestown. And what's interesting to me, I mean, it's been a point of frustration, but it's something I really admire about how you've treated these topics, is that many people actually doubt whether or not ideas matter very much. And it's very common to meet people who think that good people will do good things and bad people will do bad things, and that ideology is more or less always just a pretext for good and bad people to do whatever they were going to do anyway. But one of the most refreshing things about your discussion of these aberrant belief systems is that you make it clear how much beliefs matter, and that bad beliefs can get even very good people to do terrible things.
I would limit that mainly to, at least in our era, to religious beliefs. I think the notion that beliefs are discountable mainly comes from observing the hypocrisy of political figures and people who hold strong political views but then act completely differently in their own behavior. Whereas what intrigued me as a journalist, religion has very little status in the world of journalism. It's seen as like covering cooking or something like that in your daily newspaper. The religion beat would be in the back section. But I observed somewhere along the line that people can have very strong political views without it changing their lives at all. But people who have strong religious views, that tends to determine their behavior in a very powerful way, for good or ill.
Yeah. Well, so let's get into, first I'll name the books. There's really 3 books I want to focus on here. The Looming Tower, which is your amazing book about Al-Qaeda. And we could also throw in here the stage play and documentary, My Trip to Al-Qaeda, which is also fascinating and connected to that book. And then you have your most recent book, The Terror Years, which, again, is also on the same topic. And then there's Going Clear, which is your book, and the subsequent documentary on Scientology. And if we have time, I'd like to touch on your book, Remembering Satan, because that is just one of the strangest stories ever told. We'll see if we get there. Let's start with jihadism and Islamism. Now, you were on this topic, at least to some degree, before most people were aware of these issues, because you wrote this film, The Siege, which came out in 1998, which depicts jihadist terrorism in New York, and then kind of the attendant infringements of civil liberties that came in response. Mm-hmm. Do you remember at what point you were aware of jihadism as a global issue and not just a local problem that was narrowly focused on Israel?
Well, I had lived in Egypt as a young man, and I was there when Nasser died in 1970, and one of Sadat, who succeeded him, one of his first actions was to let the Muslim Brothers out of prison. Mm-hmm. And, one of our professors had a brother who got out, and I was aware, this stirring inside Islam, I suppose, before a lot of other Western people were. And then when I was working on The Siege, this is in the middle 90s, and, Egypt was in tumult at the time, but my producer had asked me to write a movie about a woman in the CIA. And that was the whole idea. It wasn't really, it was just a notion, really. And I was trying to think about, well, the Cold War is over. Who is the enemy? And it wasn't obvious at the time. And finally, I realized that the CIA did have a real life antagonist, and it was the FBI. And what they were struggling over was who was going to control terrorism in the United States. And that became the axis for The Siege. And Denzel Washington played the FBI chief, and Annette Bening was a CIA woman that had, the idea had been spawned from. And as I began researching that, I turned up the information about bin Laden and about, of course, there was Omar Abdul Rahman, who was known as the Blind Sheikh, who had a plan afoot to blow up the Lincoln Tunnel and the Statue of Liberty. And, there were a lot of terrorist plots that were going around at the time. And then the movie, the trailers in the movie appeared in August of '98. And that, of course, was the same month that the American embassies in East Africa were blown up by Al Qaeda. It was their opening blow.
Mm.
There was another bombing that same month in Cape Town, South Africa, that people don't really know very much about. It was at a Planet Hollywood.
Right, right.
And it was an Islamist, a radical Islamist group claimed credit for it, blaming the trailers that were for the movie The Siege
Mm.
as their provocation. And the reason they struck Planet Hollywood is that Bruce Willis, one of the co-stars of the movie, was a partial owner of that chain. So, it was a real shock to me because two people were killed and a little girl lost her leg. And all of this came about because I had written this movie. So I was affected by terrorism, I guess, earlier than most Americans.
Yeah, yeah, I had heard that story. I think you talk about that at least in My Trip to Al-Qaeda.
Right.
And that's always been why I have resisted offers to translate some of my more hard-hitting criticisms of Islam into the relevant languages, because I remember Salman Rushdie's experience of, apart from his experience of having to go into hiding, just his experience of finding out that his translators and foreign publishers had been killed or attacked. And
Yeah.
that had to be rough. Did you feel there would have been very little basis, or at least most people wouldn't have formed an expectation that anything like that would happen in response to a film like this at that point? Were you just blindsided by it, or did you feel?
I was totally thunderstruck. It was of course, now, at the same time when the movie came out, there were protests. There were Muslims were angry at being depicted as terrorists. They thought that was a stereotype of Hollywood, and they were picketing the theaters. It was a big box office failure until 9/11, when it was the most rented movie in America.
Right.
But it was a really it was a scarring experience, and it came out of the blue.
Where were you on 9/11, and what were you working on?
Well, I at that time I was having breakfast with a group. Every Tuesday morning we get together and speak Spanish. So that's where I was. And at the time I was planning to get out of journalism. I had the idea that I'd become a movie director.
Uh-huh.
I was writing scripts for me to direct, and then suddenly 9/11 happened, and I realized I was going to get back on the fire truck.
And in all the work you have done since on jihadism, what would you say you've learned about it?
Well, I've learned, for one thing, that belief is very powerful in affecting even violent behavior. But one of the things that intrigued me about the origins of this movement, especially in Egypt, is that a lot of the people who went into Al-Jihad, which was the Egyptian organization, and then later Al-Qaeda, weren't really very religious. They were drawn, in some ways, they were drawn into protest. You'd have to understand that living in Arab countries, most Arab countries at the time, was a very stifling experience. There are tyrannies, and the opportunities for expression are very few, and there's not very much alternative to either being a member of the government, a bureaucrat, or a member of the army, and then there's a very diminished private sector. And then if you want to have any kind of alternative expression, you go to the mosque. And that's where the Muslim Brothers arose. So there were people that I think were drawn into this movement, and some of them were, idealists, the kind of people that you could build a country on in other respects, but they were, their dreams had been kind of perverted and drawn into these radical expressions of Islam. One of the problems in the Arab world is there's so few spiritual choices. You can only believe one thing. Your choice is to believe it more or less. And so the what happened in Egypt was that young men who were not originally very pious would be drawn into these kind of radical groups. They were wanting to affect some kind of change in their country, but in the same time, they underwent changes themselves and they became radicalized by the more strenuous views of Islam.
Mm.
And they began to use those views to justify the actions that they were taking.
Yeah, I want to drill down a little bit on what you just said there, that they were not very religious, because I think people can misunderstand what you're saying, or perhaps you and I disagree about the implications of what you're saying. Because it's true that many people don't come from madrasas, many people don't show any signs of religiosity, much less extreme religiosity in their earlier life. But the people who become suicide bombers, at the point they become committed, really do believe what they say they believe. I mean, the beliefs are operative at that point, and the history of how they got to that point is an
Mm-hmm.
interesting one. And I mean, you can have kids in Orange County becoming radicalized, but once they are actually radicalized, they do share this belief system, and so it's a lot of people take, I think, a false comfort in looking at the biographies of some of these people, and they say, well, this person didn't come out of a madrasa. This person went to the London School of Economics. So clearly this isn't about religion. There's something else going on here. But for the person who has an awakening experience of some kind that gets channeled into Salafi style Islam, and they take it all the way into the end zone of wanting to get into paradise, right now.
Mm-hmm.
However secular they had seemed up until a year ago or 15 minutes ago, at a certain point, what gets them to actually act is this worldview that has gotten communicated to them somehow. Do you disagree with that? Do you think there's a secular route to martyrdom that is equally well subscribed in this world?
Well, if you look at the world that we're talking about now, the radical Islam, there are Islamists who become radicalized,
Hmm.
and there are radicals who become Islamized. You can come from both of those directions and arrive at the same point. And then you have people like Ramzi Youssef, who bombed the World Trade Center in 1993, not at all religious. He was just using, religious ideas. He didn't really express them himself, but he used religious compatriots, and he worked with Omar Abdul Rahman, the blind sheikh.
Hmm.
But he was not at all religious himself. And there are people like that.
Although he wasn't a suicide bomber.
No, but the world of suicide bombers inside, is a fairly small one. The world of radical Islam is quite large.
Yeah, I would agree. I guess, I mean, my issue is, I mean, I certainly don't doubt that there are some people who wage war against the West in some sense under the banner of Islam without sincerely believing all of its precepts. But and then there are gradations of this. I saw that you had interviewed my friend and collaborator Majid Nawaz, which I thought
Yeah.
I had forgotten. I had seen My Trip to Al-Qaeda some years ago when it, I think, first came out, and then watched it again in anticipation of this conversation, and then was surprised. I didn't know Majid when I had first seen it, obviously, because I had no recollection he was in there. So Majid is, when he was an Islamist, was not a budding suicide bomber. I mean, so there are different points of commitment on that spectrum of being organized under this banner. But for me, the most toxic part of the center of the bullseye here for the role of belief is, in particular, this sincere belief in martyrdom, because it seems to me this has two consequences. It allows people to actually love death more than we love life. That becomes a sincere statement of just psychological fact. And therefore, to seek death, in this, they become really undeterrable. And you describe people like this in the Looming Tower, and particularly the early Al-Qaeda members who were fighting the Soviets in Afghanistan, who were
Mm-hmm.
taking absolutely no steps to protect their own lives. And when queried about this, they said, yeah, the whole point is to get killed here, right? But the other thing is that it allows people whether they're suicide bombers or not, to kill innocents without any compunction, because really, by this worldview, nothing can go wrong. The good will go to heaven, the infidels will go to hell where they belong, and you can blow yourself up in a crowd of children and you have literally done nothing wrong, because there's no conceivable outcome that is a bad outcome, given that God is overseeing all this and everyone gets what they deserve in the end anyway.
Yeah, it's to some extent, I think that we have people that are acting out of beliefs that are giving them a moral cover for actions that one can't otherwise understand. But there are also psychopaths in this as well, and they're drawn like moths to it. And I think that a lot of the phenomenon of ISIS, is fed by that. People are excited by the carnage, and they flock to it. And then on the way, they pick up these beliefs almost like garments. A lot of the people that you see, they don't have this extremist religious background before they get there. And I don't know how seriously we're talking about. There's not a single unified theory for why all these people arrive at the same place. There are many different paths to it, and different personalities that are animated by different philosophies and longings and dysfunctions. And so they can come in many different routes. There's a interesting theory about Stefan Hertog wrote a book called Engineers of Jihad. And he talked about the number of people who come into jihad from a technical, especially engineering background, and even speculates that some of them are on the autism spectrum. And I think, you can look at, this, if you have the whole universe of people who are dedicating their lives to Islamic jihad, you're going to find that a lot of the leaders are going to be those kinds of engineering people who can use, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed is a perfect example, not a religious man himself, really. And he's Ramzi Yusuf's uncle. But he was able to use people who had these beliefs to force, to like the hijackers of 9/11 and persuade them to give up their lives to enact the vision that he's created.
Yeah. I was struck in watching My Trip to Al-Qaeda again, because I had first seen it before anyone had even heard of ISIS, I believe. I was struck at one point you were reading from some of the stated goals of Al-Qaeda at that point, and it was interesting to see how much ISIS had achieved those goals. They seemed to be in the process of losing those gains, but I had forgotten how explicit Al-Qaeda's goal was to form a caliphate in Iraq and to use it as a basis by which to ultimately create a global one and to draw us further into a quagmire there. It just seemed like ISIS was the culmination not merely of Al-Qaeda in Iraq and the crazy sectarian sadism that got expressed there, but the original vision of Al-Qaeda. How do you view ISIS as being the same or different from Al-Qaeda at this point?
Well, there are stylistic differences, and their goals are the same. They want to Islamize the world. They want Islam to be the only superpower in the world, and they feel resentful that it has been put on the back shelf in the way. To some extent, the idea of the caliphate was something that bin Laden had in mind as a distant goal, because first of all, you would have to persuade Muslims that this is something they were going to have to implement eventually. But Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, who was the founder of Al-Qaeda in Iraq, which became the precursor to ISIS, he was in a hurry, and he was not patient as bin Laden was, and also he had a yen to create a civil war inside Islam, which he succeeded in doing by waging war on the Shiites. Bin Laden wanted to fight the West. He wanted to drive the West out of Arab and Muslim lands, and so that it could be thoroughly Islamized according to the sort of his Salafi philosophy. But and then eventually, you would create a caliphate, and Zarqawi had just a different battle plan, and so he became very prominent when we had Al Qaeda under such pressure that Bin Laden and Zawahiri and the other leaders of Al Qaeda couldn't keep their heads above the ground. Meanwhile, Zarqawi's out, creating total mayhem on the ground in Iraq. And this was exciting to a lot of young Muslims who wanted to get in on the action and believed in the goals that Zarqawi was espousing.
He seemed to be a proper psychopath. Would you draw a line between someone like him and bin Laden, just psychologically there?
There are fascinating differences. When I was working on the looming tower, I was puzzled because Al Qaeda was essentially an Egyptian organization with a Saudi head on it, and there were there were a couple of Jordanians in it. But essentially, they were Persian Gulf Arabs and Egyptians. And I looked around and I wondered, where are the Palestinians? Where are the Lebanese? Where are the Jordanians and the Syrians? The region that we call the Levant. Where are they in Al Qaeda? And I realized that there was actually another training camp in Afghanistan at the same time bin Laden was running his. And it was run by Zarqawi, and he actually got money support from bin Laden, although he was not formally a member of Al Qaeda at the time. But that was the group that went into Iraq after we invaded and began to prosper there. And so you look at bin Laden, he was an international businessman, college educated, wealthy, extremely wealthy at one point. Sort of I compared him, I described him as Saudi Arabia's first celebrity. And, he had a lot of, not charisma, but more of a mystique about him. And he was in some ways kind of delicate in his mannerisms and so on. Whereas Zarqawi was a criminal. He was a street thug and sex criminal, and he was in prison. And it was in prison that he became close to the Sheikh Makdizi, who was a very influential jihadist philosopher. And I think, he was already radical, psychopathic, and then in some ways emboldened by this Islamist philosophy that gave him a warrant to act out the way that I think that he normally wanted to anyway. So, his kind of madness, the way that he rampaged across Iraq, killing anyone in his path, suddenly he had absolute divine permission to do so. And there was something awe-inspiring about the way that he waged this unlimited war against the Shiites. And for people that are, drawn to conflict, he caught a lot of attention. I imagine you're familiar with the Freud's term, the narcissism of minor differences.
Yeah.
I think that that's really fascinating where religion is concerned, because Freud talks about how people that are very, very similar in most respects can be the biggest enemies because of very small differences between the two of them. And the Sunnis and the Shiites are a perfect example of that. For outsiders, they're just Muslims. Mm-hmm. But for Zarqawi and many people who followed him, the small historical differences and the stylistic differences in the way they prayed, for instance, were incredibly inflammatory. And, it has created absolute chaos inside the Islamic universe.
That gives me an opportunity to point out something that I often point out when I'm talking about Islam and Islamism and jihadism, and where everything I say is more or less implicitly or explicitly in criticism of the doctrine here and the consequences of these ideas, and linking this doctrine to violence. The thing to point out is that the most common victim of this violence is another Muslim.
Yeah, by 1,000-fold.
Yes, yeah. I mean, this is not merely the effete concern of a pampered Westerner who doesn't want terrorism in his movie theaters. The reality is the world is on fire with this particular form of sectarian conflict. And, now we're witnessing very likely Europe break apart in part as a result of this conflict in Syria and Iraq and the attendant migrant crisis, something I might raise with you in a minute. But tell me about Ayman al-Zawahiri in this context. I mean, so how do you view him as a personality compared to Zarqawi and bin Laden?
Well, he was a man of science, which is interesting.
Mm.
He was a medical doctor, a surgeon. His father was a professor of pharmacology at Cairo University. So he came from a science background, but he was also very religious as a young man, and as was bin Laden. There was not a conversion experience for either man. They just became more deeply implicated in their religion. And it was, I think the experience of when Zawahiri went off with Muslim brother doctors to Afghanistan during the Mujahideen war against the Soviets, I think that was a turning point for him. And he had already, at the age of 15, had created a cell to overthrow the Egyptian government.
Right.
Just think about
his precocious
the audacity of this young man. Partly, I think he was very influenced by his uncle, who was Sayyid Qutb's lawyer. And Sayyid Qutb is, in some ways, I guess you could say, yeah. I mean, it's always intriguing to me, Sam, how movements and belief systems always go back to a book. And, you can trace it in, the Bible or the Quran or Das Kapital or Hitler's Mein Kampf, or even animal rights as animal liberation. I mean, there's always at the bottom of it a book that is so influential. And the book that really gave rise to the Islamist movement was a book that Qutb wrote called Ma'alim fil Tariq, which means signposts along the road or milestones.
Mm-hmm.
And he had, in the late 40s, he had kind of fled Egypt because King was mad at him, and came to America, where he was alarmed and disgusted by the American habits, especially our sexual mores, and he spent time in this little town called Greeley, Colorado, which in some respects would be a total advertisement for
the American dream. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a darling little town, and had a lot of churches and so on, but and there was nothing that anybody could do that pleased him. Even his barber didn't do his hair right, but he saw some things about America that I think Americans weren't willing to look at. For instance, Sayyid Qutb was a very dark Egyptian, and he experienced the racism that was common at the time. He had crazy notions about a lot of things about America, but he went back to Egypt and wrote some very influential articles, and then became the head of the sort of underground wing of the Muslim Brothers, the more violent wing. And when Gamal Abdel Nasser and the colonels in the Egyptian army staged their coup in 1952, Nasser offered Qutb an influential post in the new government, but it wasn't influential enough. And Qutb fought against Nasser and the regime, and eventually Nasser had him hanged. Mm. And that, he became this martyr. But this book that he wrote on scrap paper that he smuggled out of the prison became the document that aroused and he called for a vanguard of young men who would make this vision real. And Zawahiri was certainly one of those people.
One thing that's rarely remarked on, but you do it in places, is that the men in Muslim majority countries grow up largely outside the company of women. And I mean, for instance, like the story you told about Qutb, as I recall, the crisis point for him in his sojourn in Greeley was he went to a dance where he saw the young, must have been teenagers, young men and women dancing I think in the basement of a church. So the fact that they had used their church for this desecration, and he saw, these young men and women kind of pawing at each other, and he there's a passage in somewhere where he talks about just the utter shamelessness of the batting eyes of the women and the skin exposed, and what comes through.
The
more
song
than anything
was
else.
"Baby It's Cold Outside."
Right. I mean, there's such obvious frustrated lust here, and the role played by sexual taboos and the disempowerment of being on the outside of any sphere in which you could plausibly gratify your desires in a way that seemed psychologically and morally healthy to you.
Mm-hmm.
It's just there's something psychologically so maladaptive about the way sex is viewed in this context. And so I just wanted you to reflect on that. Is there anything we can generalize about the consequences of keeping the sexes so radically apart, and the attendant misogyny, I mean, the political non-equivalence between men and women in these societies?
Well, my experience of it was especially acute in Saudi Arabia. I went there in, I guess it was 2003, I guess 2003 or 4. And, the Saudis wouldn't let me in as a journalist. So I took a job as the mentor to these young journalists in Jeddah, which is bin Laden's hometown. And the men and women really have almost no interaction at all. We think of for instance, the women all dressed up in black, and sometimes their faces covered as well. But the men are pretty covered up too. They're in white and the women are in black. It looks like sometimes I would feel like I was in an opera, with a kind of Capuchin monks or something like that going. And one of my reporters, we went to a mall, and there are some malls where men can't go by themselves if they're not in a family. But this was one mall where we could go in. My reporter was especially avid Romeo, and he spotted a couple of Saudi women coming down the escalator, and they were totally encased in black. Even their eyes were covered. I mean, sometimes you can't even tell what direction they're facing. And he turned to me without a trace of irony. He said, "Check them out." There's some power that he must have to see through those garments.
It's clairvoyance.
I was always aware. I was totally aware of the sense of longing and of frustration. And also a lot of civilization is young men learning how to please girls. You cannot get past that. And when they're outside of that world, and in a world of men almost exclusively, then it's a totally unsettled situation where behaviors are not moderated, and also they take out their frustrations in other ways. What's intriguing about Saudi society is that there's a great sense of passivity, and I think is born of being demoralized, and at the same time you have so much of the stream going into radical Islam, into Al-Qaeda or other groups, come out of Saudi Arabia. And certainly the ideas, the propaganda that feeds these religious ideas comes out of Saudi Arabia. It's not entirely traceable to the gender apartheid, but it is a part of it. And the absence of civil society, the inability to mix freely and talk openly, all of those things create this stifled atmosphere.
Yeah, there's also the fact that this division between the sexes is part of a larger honor culture, and then what happens there is you have the women become essentially props in the honor economy of the men. I mean, women become viewed as, especially their sexual lives and the prospect that there could be some sexual indiscretion, whether it's your wife or your daughter, the fact that would reflect back on you and your social currency as a person of honor, that all seems so dysfunctional and such a perfect recipe for unhappiness. And yet it's hard to see how to change it given the status quo.
Well, the one thing we should not make the mistake of taking away any sense of agency from these women, the Saudi women. I had several young Saudi women reporters who I was supposed to mentor. And at first they wouldn't let me see them. They all worked in this little office under the stairwell. And I said, I can't mentor them if I can't see them. So once a week, they were allowed to come up in this little black train into the conference room. And one I got to know particularly well, Najwa. She was extremely conservative, and she wore the abaya, which is the black body veil, and the hijab over her head. But she also wore a niqab to cover her face, everything except for the eyes. And she used to cover her eyes as well, but she kept tripping. So but she would put on gloves. She talked about how she tried to become more conservative every year. And and I also reflected on the fact that, Saudi women are the mothers of these boys.
Yeah.
They have a responsibility in how they turn out. And I went to Saudi Arabia thinking that women would be a reservoir of progressive movement of some sort. And I didn't find that. There were some women who were that way. But in general, I would not say that Saudi women are a force of liberal ideas.
I would be surprised if they were. The beliefs exist on both sides of this divide. And when I see how a friend like Ayaan Hirsi Ali gets attacked by women who are defending their faith from her criticism,
Mm-hmm.
or Majid Nawaz gets attacked by women as an Uncle Tom. You see what's going on there. Can you say something about the prevalence of conspiracy thinking in the Arab world as you encountered it?
Yeah, I was thinking about that as I was preparing to talk with you, because I find that there's a kind of parallel through the kind of fake news that we're going through now. And when I was working in the Arab press in Saudi Arabia, the one thing I noted is that you can have opinions, and the newspapers are full of columnists. But what was dangerous were facts. And when I was trying to teach these young reporters how to go out and gather facts, I was actually providing them with skills that they weren't going to be able to use. So the newspapers were vacuous and gossip mongering. And after 9/11, I remember when I was in Egypt and I was talking to this Egyptian woman who suggested to me that 9/11 was something that the American government did to itself, which was a very common thing. I ran into it again and again. And I said, how can you believe that? I mean, there's no evidence that the American government had any desire to do that or had any way to participate in it. I mean, it's a totally nonsensical, prejudicial view. What causes you to say that? And she said, well, in Egypt, nobody ever tells us the truth. So we have to determine for ourselves what it might be. And the first question we ask is, who benefits? And in her view, the beneficiary of 9/11 was the American government, because it allowed the U.S. to wage war on the Muslim world. Well, I can't tell you how common this view is. And there's absolutely nothing to sustain it. It is just a conspiracy theory that has taken root. and unfortunately given some support by a number of American conspiracists
Yeah,
as
have you
well.
gone down that rabbit hole very far? The 9/11 truth phenomenon in the West?
Oh yeah. Oh, they used to follow me around in my speeches, and Alex Jones and I've had a conversation before. He's one of the main propagators of this kind of nonsense. It and I've talked to them at length. If you analyze their view of how 9/11 happened, there's not any doubt that the plane struck the World Trade Center, at least among most of them.
Unless you think they were holograms or not actual planes.
Yeah, there are people that
they had no windows. Yeah,
they go even further, that it never happened at all. Yeah, it's like the moon landing never happened. But the 9/11 truthers normally believe that the planes did strike, but that's not what would happen if a plane hit a skyscraper. And of course, this experiment has only happened twice. So, and in both cases, the buildings fell down. But according to the truthers, that's not what would happen.
When have you ever seen a building fall into its own footprint, Lawrence?
Yes, right. So, what happened? Well, there must have been explosives planted inside the building to make sure that they fell. And that's where the American government came in, because they had to be, stealthily done. Nobody could have observed them. There had to be no evidence for it. And then in the case of the Pentagon, which didn't fall down, and, there are a lot of truthers who say that was a missile. It wasn't a plane. If that's the case, where are the passengers? Where's the plane? What about all the people who saw the plane flying low over? Once you start picking apart the things they accept as gospel, there's just nothing but a ludicrous thread of conspiracy, all knitted together into something that's totally absurd, but which corresponds to their view of how the world works.
Yeah, and crucially, when you follow each one of these anomalies to some alternative conclusion, it's never the same conclusion. There's no unified view of what would explain everything that happened here. There's dozens or hundreds or more different things, all of which are mutually incompatible, but all of which are different from the prevailing story that Al-Qaeda did it.
Mm-hmm.
But there is no unified view that makes it the perfect work of evil genius to have George Bush sitting reading My Pet Goat when this thing goes off. What evil genius decided to do it that way? I mean, this larger phenomenon of conspiracy thinking, which, again, now once you connect it to the fake news phenomenon that we're living through now, it becomes hugely consequential. It's like this. I've always thought of conspiracy thinking as a kind of pornography of doubt. There's an itch that people are scratching here.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
People who, for the most part, feel disempowered and imagine that people in power are always doing something malicious, and that whenever you can explain something based on incompetence, it's never really incompetence. The irony here is they're attributing a superhuman level of competence to people where there's never any evidence of this kind of competence. I mean, Bill Clinton couldn't stop a semen-stained dress from appearing on the evening news, right?
Yeah.
Presidents can't do these sorts of things, and yet we're asked to imagine that thousands upon thousands of psychopathic collaborators killed some of the most productive people in our society in downtown Manhattan just for the pleasure of sending us to war in the Middle East, not to Saudi Arabia where the hijackers came from, but to Iraq, when we could have easily found a pretext to go to war there anyway, and what a great war that was. And yet they did this without a single leak. There's not one person with a guilty conscience who got on 60 Minutes and spilled the beans, and yet, generally speaking, you can't even keep the next iPhone from being left on the bar before it gets released. It's an amazing double standard of reasonableness there that gives us this kind of thinking. But what's your feeling about the fake news phenomenon that we are now living through?
I think that the elevation of fake news to the level of real news is so pernicious and damaging, and it reminds me so much of my experience in the Arab world, where conspiracies and um, and vie for any kind of credibility with real news. And when journalism has been weakened, I mean, for more than 2 decades now, there's been a cutback of, the resources of journalism, so that the roots of our trade have been partially pulled up, especially at the local level. And
Mm.
it's very difficult, to measure how big a loss that has been. But, it used to be that there were, news bureaus all over the world, that we had, different networks had, the bureaus in all the world capitals and so on. And we were much more plugged in than we are now. And now the next step was the increasing partisanship that took over, especially the broadcast media, so that in addition to reporting what was the news, there was a spin on it, an implicit comment on how the world is. And so you get your news from one station or another, you have a different impression of, what was actually going on. And so there's not a consensus as there used to be about what was actually happening. And then finally, the internet solidified this kind of echo chamber so that people could go on the internet, and naturally what they do is they go find confirmatory information that supports their prejudices. So these three trends have converged to the point that it's very difficult for some people to distinguish what is real and what is fake. And that is a very dangerous situation, and it allows conspiracies to prosper and go viral like crazy.
How do you think jihadists view the prospect of a Trump presidency?
I think with some glee. One of the goals of many jihadists is to create a polarization between the West and Islam. And certainly Trump has not been loath to use language like that. So it may well be that he will press more strongly on the military accelerator and try to, do more damage. But our experience with that has been really mixed. And, even Rumsfeld, when he was the Secretary of Defense, worried that we were creating more jihadists than we were killing. And that's a continual problem. I'm not saying there's an easy solution or alternative, but the ways in which we have mixed into the Arab world and the Muslim world have not been so far very successful.
What would you do if you were advising a president at this point? If you just think about the problem of ISIS and terrorist groups like ISIS, how would you fight this problem?
Well, I think you have to be very cautious about how deeply you get into it militarily. I'm not saying we have to be absent, but we should not be putting boots on the ground where we have no national interest. Let's take the example of Syria. Syria it's a strange country. I was there before the Arab Spring, and it was total dictatorship. And the most secular Arab country I'd ever been in. I have to say that I was so surprised to see this turn towards the Islamist revolution in a country where I had not really detected that at all. But what could we do, or could we have done in Syria? It's not clear to me how we could have behaved in a way that would have prevented a catastrophe.
You don't think taking out Assad's air force before the Russians got involved might have been a good step?
It might have, but then what would the consequences of that have been? The choice that we were really facing, as it turns out, is between a regime that is really the progeny of Stalin or Hitler. I mean, it's the same mindset, and it's appalling. Or Al-Qaeda, the strongest force, even today, outside of the government forces, which are supported by Russia, is al-Nusra, the Al-Qaeda affiliate. And that's a terrible choice for any country to make. But the truth is that the Assad regime posed no threat to America. And given that reality, I don't think that we had very much to gain by overthrowing Assad.
Mm.
Uh, if and I don't endorse him staying in power, but not. I don't think he should be removed until there's a clear consensus about how to support the Syrian government in a way that won't lead to an ethnic cleansing of the Alawites and other religious minorities,
Mm.
including moderate Sunnis in that country. And so we have one outcome that we're living in that we know is terrible, but the alternative outcomes may have been as bad. And one lesson I've learned from living in the Middle East for a lot of years is that things can always turn out worse.
I totally agree that this is a situation where it's not clear that success was on the menu in any discernible form, and all options on their face appear to be bad. But even in that situation, we seem to have found a surprisingly bad option, which is, we have a president who drew a red line, which, when crossed, proved to be an empty bluff that damaged the prestige of our country significantly in the eyes of both our friends and our enemies. And then we just sat by and watched another, I think you could call it a genocide. I mean, when 500,000 people die, it's pretty close to a genocide. So our claims of never doing that again after Rwanda are as hollow as we could have ever feared they would be. And now to everyone's astonishment, we may be witnessing the rise of fascist-style populism in Europe and the breakup of Europe in response to the migrant crisis, which, I mean, that was, if you told us that was likely to happen if we didn't contain this problem, I feel like the civilized world, Europeans in particular, would have worked harder to contain it.
Well, here is where I think America can do something. And I think the migrant crisis it offers the legacy of terrorism in the future for decades to come. And if you think about, for instance, the Palestinian exodus, the entire Palestinian diaspora was 750,000 people. And think of all the misery that they've endured and have created for others in the form of terrorism. They're sort of the progenitors of modern terror. 5 million, now close to 6 million Syrians outside of their country, and that's not counting close to 11 million people who are displaced internally. That is a repository of despair. And according to UNICEF, about half of those refugees are children, and only 20% of them are getting any kind of education. So if you were a 6-year-old child in 2011, you've already lost your entire elementary school education.
Yeah.
So what future do you have? And I understand the anxiety that Americans and frankly people all over the world feel about bringing Syrian refugees or any Muslim refugees into their country. It's perfectly understandable. But the status quo is also very dangerous, and left untended and uneducated, unemployed, unhoused, unfed. This population could become a headache in the future that is the dimensions of which would have a very hard time estimating.
Suddenly the whole world has the character of Israel a few decades ago. I mean, this is something that I've always worried about, that it's very hard to put a boundary on this problem. And I was by no means expecting to see this kind of knock-on effects in Europe, but it's amazing to see. And it's amazing to see how ill-equipped we are to deal with it, because the moral imperative to help these terribly unlucky people is really compelling. You shine a spotlight on any individual family with kids about whom there is no reason to suspect a commitment to jihadism. Of course you want to help these people. I mean, you're there, but for the dint of just a roll of the dice, that would be me and my family born in Syria.
Right.
Who am I to keep them out on some level? But when you just look at the fact that some percentage of any population drawn at random from Muslim majority countries will be committed to views that are deeply antithetical to the values of Western civil society. Freedom of speech, freedom of thought, freedom to
Mm.
apostatize. It's very difficult to see what we should do
Well,
about this.
it's so far, at least in America, we've done a rather good job of incorporating asylum seekers.
But there, we're just lucky to have oceans, right? I mean, we just haven't had to
Yes.
confront this problem geographically. What would we do if we were Germany or any of these neighboring countries where people were just showing up on the train tracks and we had to decide what to do with them?
I do fear that that Europe as a political entity will fracture, and yet maybe the more immediate danger is in that region, still in the Middle East. Our nominal allies, for instance, Jordan has 1 million Syrian refugees in it. 1 out of 4 people in Lebanon is a Syrian refugee. 2 million refugees in Turkey. These are the people that we nominally call our allies, and that kind of demography can capsize those governments. And then you have, inside those camps, the rise of alienation. It's, I think that here is a place where America could lead by trying to help those really helpless people and demonstrate our goodwill. And that would create a repository of goodwill rather than just despair for the future.
But what are you picturing by way of help? I mean, even if we said we're going to put our best people on this, we're going to vet as many people as we can, as fast as we can, and this year we are going to take a whopping 400,000 refugees into our society. First of all, that seems impossible. But even if it were possible, it is just, what, a tenth of the problem?
Yeah, I think we should take a share, and the vetting and stuff like that we have to do should be done, and it takes a long time. But in the larger sense, I don't think that politically, we're in a place where we're going to see that happen.
Mm.
But that doesn't mean that doing nothing is a good alternative. I think we should be over there building schools and shelter. We should try to be carving out space inside Syria where they can return. There are places that are probably secure now, and the as much as we can confine the spillover of migrants to that region and try to return them to their own country, that's something that we should set as a goal.
But doesn't that suggest some sort of military involvement to create those safe spaces and maintain their
I
safety?
think you have to work, for instance, if you're working on the Turkish border, you work with the Turkish security services, and the same with Jordan. And so, these people these countries want the refugees out of their country more than we want them back in Syria. And I think that, the truth is, especially with Turkey, they've been so complicit in allowing this problem to get so far out of hand. And I think they're beginning to feel the consequences of it with these explosions that they've had recently, and the mass murders.
Yeah.
This is a problem that in some respects that they have grown. We can't assume responsibility for all the problems in the world, but I think the world does need our guidance.
Yeah, no doubt. Well, the marriage of the concept of guidance with the incoming occupant of the Oval Office.
Yeah, I know.
A little hard to square that, but I think we'll talk about him in a minute because the parallels between him and L. Ron Hubbard are difficult to overlook. But a final question in this area. You actually have written a book about the peace process with respect to the Palestinians and the Israelis, which I haven't read, 13 Days in September, about the Camp David Accords there with Carter and Sadat and Begin. How do you view the prospects of a democratic Israel at this point?
Well, I think Israel has made a terrible mistake in empowering the settlers, and I think honestly that the two-state solution has been dead for some time, and it simply hasn't been acknowledged. And honestly, if the people in the region really wanted a two-state solution, there would be two states. There's inside Israel, there's very diminished peace movement. And I think among those people who would like to see a two-state solution, they're so demoralized and beaten by the rise of the kind of right-wing politics inside that country that there's just not very much energy devoted to that. And the Palestinians are also led by a kind of stagnant leadership, aging, out of touch, uninterested in really pursuing an alternative plan, and losing the patience of the rest of the world. And I think honestly, when John Kerry started his efforts to bring about a two-state solution, he said quite openly, this will be the last time that America invests this kind of interest in creating two states. And I think that was an accurate statement. I doubt that we'll see any, I know that Trump has said that he loved to make the deal. And if he's the great deal maker that he claims to be, then this is the deal of a lifetime. But, what happened with Carter, Sadat, and Begin, which was so interesting to me, these were three men of three different religions. They were all very pious men. And actually, Carter and Sadat probably more so than Begin, but Begin was the first Orthodox Jew to lead Israel. So they came together to solve a problem that religion itself had largely caused. And that interested me, how they were able to overcome their differences and their animosity. I mean, Sadat and Begin hated each other. And after the first couple of days, Carter had this notion that the Camp David would last 3 or 4 days. It was so clearly in the interest of each of these men to make peace that they would come to agreement. They would, first of all, get to know each other, and they would come to like each other, and they would trust each other. And the opposite happened. They just flared up after the second day. Carter couldn't let them be in the same room with each other. And the lesson of Camp David, I think, is that political courage is what really is the missing ingredient in the peace process in the Middle East now, and I suppose to some extent in the U.S. But these men had terrible frailties, and Sadat and Begin were violent men. Sadat had been a Nazi collaborator. He was an assassin. Begin was a terrorist leader. They're scarcely the kind of people that you would think would come together and shake hands and make peace. But they had in common a tremendous amount of political courage, and so did Carter.
And it really was courage, because in the case of Sadat, he was killed over this.
He was killed for it, and I think he must have had some sense of the price that he would pay. But, Carter lost the next election, probably more because of the Iran situation, but he was the first Democratic nominee not to carry a plurality of the Jewish vote. And then Begin, shortly after Camp David, with no longer having to worry about the Egyptians, he invaded Lebanon, an operation that was supposed to take 48 hours, and Israel was in Lebanon for 18 years. And Begin was ostracized and went into seclusion for the last 9 years of his life. So in a way, each of these men paid a terrible price for what they achieved. But what they achieved, peace between Israel and Egypt, there hasn't been a single violation of that treaty since it was signed in 1979. And it's so remarkable to look at the Middle East, which is in such tumult, worse today than it has ever been in my lifetime. But think how much worse it would be if Egypt and Israel were still at war.
Yeah. I thought Majid, who we mentioned before, made an interesting point in response to the recent UN resolution against Israel. And this idea, this opposition, which is always invoked, as you just did, between the settlers and the two-state solution, is something that Majid just called into question, and perhaps others have done this, but I actually hadn't heard this. He said, there's nothing in principle about Jews living in the settlements in what will ultimately be Palestinian territory, or the state of Palestine, that prevents the formation of such a state. The idea that anyone expects that Jews wouldn't be able to live among Muslims in Palestine is someone who expects the Palestinians to be absolute barbarians once they get a state, right? The assumption is they're just going to kill all the Jews once they have their own autonomous state. Isn't that, I mean, that's a weird subtext to this negotiation, isn't it?
It is. The Jews lived in, the Middle East forever. And even in Saudi Arabia, they were there when Prophet Muhammad came into being, and unfortunately after 1967, but even earlier after 48, Jews were largely driven out of the Arab world with a great loss to the Arab world, because there's so many community leaders and so on that left that region, and it became less diverse and far less interesting. But there is the precedent of Jews and Muslims living together and did so for centuries and centuries. But now we think that's impossible. It's funny, when I was working on the siege, I was studying. I went to Brooklyn, where Arabs and Jews live together quite happily because they have the same grocery stores, the same kind of foods, and they dress very similarly. They naturally gravitate to each other, living in the same boroughs.
Yeah, well, falafel is the underlying principle there.
Yeah, halal food and so on. All of that, causes them to feel a commonality that they actually have. And one of the things that I get really frustrated by is that the notion that the Arabs and Jews are different peoples. Genetic testing shows that they're the same. This whole idea, that the Palestinians, for instance, were a boat people that came in from somewhere far away, is absurd. The idea that the Jews were in Egypt and were a chosen people, and they spent 40 years crossing the desert. Actually the promised land that was always a part of Egypt at that time is all part of the Egyptian empire. So they were never out of Egypt in a way. But these kinds of ancient mythologies that drive so much of our current political predicaments. Even people who don't subscribe to their literal truth follow them as if they did.
Let's move seemingly a great distance, but I think we'll find it's not very far at all, to Scientology, because your book and Alex Gibney's documentary based on your book, both are fascinating there. You say at one point that your goal wasn't to write an expose of Scientology, rather you simply just wanted to understand the organization and the phenomenon, but it really couldn't help but be an expose given how goofy the belief system actually is, and given how much is known and how much there was to know about L. Ron Hubbard.
Mm-hmm.
It seems to me the Mormons have a similar problem here, but to a lesser degree, because given how much there is to know about Joseph Smith and how less than divine many of the details of his life were, to shine any light at all on the man is to diminish the whole enterprise of Mormonism. I mean, there's just no way to overlook the fact that he was just a highly libidinous con man on some basic level. And one of the most amazing things about L. Ron Hubbard, and this comes through in your book, but it was especially vivid for me when just looking at footage of him in the documentary, is just how unimpressive he seemed as a person. I can't see how people were taken in by him. And it's a similar problem I have with Donald Trump. I mean, both of these men, to my eye, are just so obviously making it up as they go along. They're just bullshitting every minute of the day. I don't see how this isn't, in the case of Hubbard, wasn't more obvious to everyone. I mean, were you flabbergasted to encounter L. Ron Hubbard in all his confabulatory glory?
Oh, I totally understand what you're saying. He looks so goofy, and it seems impossible that anyone would have taken him seriously. But then I've talked to a lot of people who knew him intimately and were maybe on one of his cruises where, he went off on this little Scientology Navy exploring the world. And they talk about how deeply impressed they were to be in his presence, and this sense of charisma. And I thought that there must be something about that word charisma that is like a cloak that somehow the audience puts on its leader, and then they suddenly see something that we can't see. That he's charming and wise and glamorous, and those things are invisible to me. But I accept the fact that through the eyes of the acolytes, that they must see it that way.
Glamour is a funny word here because one of the other parallels between Trump and Hubbard, in my view, is their terrible style. The gilded stages of those Scientology events look like
Hmm.
Trump's apartment to me. And there's some level of bad taste that I view as kind of morally disqualifying. I guess it is just a matter of taste for many people, and some people view that as glamour or exactly what you should be doing once you've made it. The thing for me is just both men in different contexts have such a patent history of lying about almost everything. I mean, just lying on a scale that you would just think would stop the rotation of the earth. Trump lies about how many floors his buildings have. He'll just add 10 extra floors to a building that don't exist, right? And Hubbard, I mean, the stories of Hubbard standing around with his devotees, pointing at various places in the night sky and saying, that's where the fifth invader force lives, and the leader has this name, and we were driving cars, 75 million years ago. There's a galactic overlord named Xenu. I mean, just saying all these things in a context where it's all perfectly unfalsifiable and just manifestly crazy, and yet it's being believed by seemingly very bright people. For instance, did you ever meet an ex-Scientologist who still believed some measure of the mythology, and or were they all just amazed that they had ever believed any of it? Are they all like Paul Haggis? Or are some people still struggling with their lingering faith in Xenu and the hydrogen bombs and the volcanoes and all the rest?
Oh, yeah. I've met a number of people that have struggled as they've come out of Scientology with shedding the entire apparatus. They wanted often, and in a way, I suppose they're not really ex-Scientologists until they do that, but they may be outside of the grip of the organization. There's I think, several things going on. One is, they were enchanted in almost a literal sense of the meaning of that word, by the the ideology, by the entranced by the idea that you've had previous lives and that you will have more of them, and sort of caught up in this scheme that, I mean, what's fascinating about Hubbard is he just wrote endlessly, elaborating this fanciful cosmology. And if you accept the general principle of it, then you sometimes get caught up in the little nets of different kinds of elaborations of his scheme, and you become an expert, almost like a mathematician studying formulas and how this would work and how that would work and this would equal that. If you're inside that world for a prolonged period of time, then it acquires a kind of reality for you.
Although one of the strange things, and this is different between Scientology and really any other religion that I'm aware of, they hold back some of the crazier metaphysics and fake history, the cosmology, until you are deep into it. Paul Haggis describes this experience of reaching a certain level of his spiritual development and then being given the innermost documents of the organization, right, where he is given a briefcase and has to go into like a bank vault to look at these handwritten pages that give you the answer at the back of the book of the cosmos. And this is where, and he describes it, his experience there, he was wondering whether it was some kind of insanity test. If you believe this, they kick you out of the organization, because it was all, this was the stuff about Xenu, and that the souls of criminals were flown to our planet, which is called, I think, Tigiak.
Yeah.
Or TGAC, and then flown on something that curiously was the spitting image of a DC-9, I believe, or DC-8. And this is what, billions of years ago, trillions of years ago?
Yeah.
And these souls are dropped into volcanoes and then plastered with hydrogen bombs. He had been in the organization for years and years before hearing this.
Yes, and what's interesting about Haggis, and I think that it's probably true of the majority of Scientologists, he never really believed it, but he sort of assented to it in the sense that all this other stuff seems to be meaningful or helpful to me. And, there were all these different, what Hubbard did mostly was create this elaborate scheme of human behavior. And how people react and what causes what generates our behavior and what processes can change it. And so for the most part, Scientologists have their heads buried in that. And, I don't know I don't think I know any Scientologists who spend a whole lot of time thinking about Xenu and Tijiak and all of that. I mean, when we talk about belief, it's always hard to know what people actually believe is true and what they just accept and don't spend much time dwelling on.
Yeah.
I mean, there are plenty of, people who are, filling Christian churches, for instance, who may not believe that, Jesus rose from the dead, or that he was born of a virgin mother, but they are in it for the community, or there are just tons of reasons why people associate themselves with beliefs that they don't actually believe.
Yeah. On that point, I should say I hear from pastors who are atheists but can't figure out what else to do with their lives, so they're still ministering.
I've had mixed experiences with when I grew up in Dallas, and we were very involved in our church and Methodist church. And then years later, one of a pastor from a different church who'd been a close family friend, his wife had died, and he'd come to Austin where I live. And he said, we had lunch, and he said, Larry, I never believed any of that crap. And wow, that was unsettling. And then the pastor at the First Methodist Church in Dallas where we attended, after I left, a man named Walker Rayleigh, who strangled his wife into a coma, and he was acquitted. But he never contested the civil suit that her parents brought, and he was having an affair with the woman who was the daughter of our pastor when we were there, and she used to play the piano in my father's Sunday school class. So, all of these religious, mentors have shown that, they have not just feet of clay, but sometimes very dangerous impulses.
Have you been threatened or harassed by Scientologists in the aftermath of your book and film?
Well, Alex and I, first of all, going back, it started off as a New Yorker profile of Paul Haggis. And we were subject then, and then the subsequent book, and then the subsequent documentary, innumerable lawsuit threats. And
any actual suits?
No, it was all noise and, trying to, Halloween scare you, But I was well defended by a New Yorker attorney and by the Knopf attorney, and we had attorneys, a number of them at HBO, which was doing the documentary. So we always felt that we were on firm ground. And the other thing about the threat of a lawsuit against a journalist is that he who brings a suit opens himself up to discovery. And I would love to get into the Scientology records, and I think they know that. So none of these suits ever materialized. And I made clear, I always gave the church its opportunity to respond to any charges that were being made against it. And there was a scene that. Totally wild scene in New Yorker. The Scientology spokesperson, who originally would not talk to me, came to the New Yorker offices along with his assistant and 4 lawyers, and a a truckload of documents to respond to all these queries that I had 7 linear feet of them. And I looked at that and I thought, they're trying to drown me in information, but you don't drown a reporter in
Right,
information.
right.
It's like pouring water on a fish, it just gives me more room to swim. And I thought, I've got a book here. And so it turned out to be very useful. But, not just the church, but individual Scientologists such as, Tom Cruise and John Travolta and others, their lawyers threatened us. And
Hmm.
but after the article came out and after the book and after the documentary, what happened was not so much me and Alex Gibney, although we had people following us at public events and so on. The people that talked to us were harassed in disgraceful ways. And I get really angry when I think about it. And I just appreciate the courage that it took for those people to step out. And they knew what risk they were taking. And it's not just the harassment that they were getting from the church, but, the fact that families would disconnect with them, their children or their mother or somebody wouldn't talk to them ever again. That's a terrible price to pay. But they willingly did it in order to shed light on this organization.
It's interesting to connect this back to jihadism for a moment and to see the parallel here, because there really strikes me as a bit of a double standard here, because Scientology is mostly viewed as a cult, even though it has tax-exempt status as a religion. And the kind of harassment you speak about seems odious and no one would defend it, but we are talking about people just, standing outside your house with a video camera and being creepy, and maybe you can tell me exactly how they were harassed, but, I'm pretty sure they weren't beheaded on television or burned alive. And if you imagine if Scientology had a doctrine, not merely of disconnection, but the doctrine that apostates should be killed, right? And that this was carried out from time to time, and it was a credible threat globally for anyone who was a former Scientologist. I mean, how do you think we would treat the Church of Scientology? Would we do something differently?
Yeah, I think that, if they're perpetrating criminal actions against non-Scientologists, I am sure that, the nation would be aroused. And, probably you mentioned the Mormons at the beginning of this segment, and, the most despised group in American history, practically, and hounded from one state to another, and their leader assassinated. And I think Scientology has taken a leaf from that book. You do not want to provoke non-Scientologists. You save your wrath for the apostates of the religion, and it keeps it closer. This whole phenomenon of disconnection what they call breaking off family members and people that are influential. It might open you up to other ideas other than Scientology. Ironically, my very first book was about the Amish, who practiced something very similar. And yet we think of the Amish as being totally harmless, and they are harmless in many respects. They're pacific. They're sweet people. I really enjoyed my time with them. But
I've said before that when the Amish go berserk, the worst they do is they cut your beard off.
Yeah, it's true. But they are a fundamentalist, cult-like group. But it shows you that you can have these practices. One of the differences with the Amish is that they ask their young people to leave the their group, their community, for a period of a year to go out in the world.
Yeah, Rumspringa.
Yeah, see what it's like, see what, and then come back of your own free will. Well, of course, you can't really go back if you don't go back. And you can't marry outside of your, the little clan, that when my wife and I were in central Pennsylvania studying this, is in the Kishocoquillas Valley, in the middle, just below State College. And it's famous among anthropologists for this schismatic nature of it. And, there were the old order Amish with different color buggies.
Mm.
And, if you're a yellow buggy, you do not marry into the white buggies or the black buggies. And if you do, even in this tiny little community, you're cut off from your family. And it's a very cruel practice, I think. But it's enforced, and the Scientologists are far more pernicious in the ways in which they punish their members, and they extract money from them. They actually imprison them on occasion. There's no comparison with how the Amish behave, but it's intriguing to me that practices among religious groups often parallel each other.
This just speaks to the issue that specific ideas and specific doctrines actually matter.
Mm-hmm.
The Amish would be different if they had a doctrine that, if your daughter talks back to you before her wedding day, you should stone her to death.
Right.
If that were an active doctrine, if the difference between heaven and hell depended on your following that precept or not, it would matter. And I got to think it would matter if the Scientologists were living their lives the way the most doctrinaire Islamists and jihadists do. Perhaps being a little PC, even framing it that way. I mean, just conservative Muslims the world over. If they were forcing their women and girls to wear burqas, if they were performing clitorectomies on their daughters, if they were from time to time throwing homosexuals from the rooftop of the Celebrity Center, there would be a SWAT team on the doorstep of every one of those centers in the country tomorrow morning. And yet Scientology is, to compare Scientology and Islam would be viewed by certainly most progressive people and certainly all Muslims as a slur. But I think the balance of scary practices, I mean, the Scientologists can certainly be scary, but the balance really is on the side of conservative, Wahhabi, Salafi-style Islam.
Well, when I was investigating Scientology, I bumped into an FBI investigation. They were interviewing some of the same people I was interviewing. And so I began to get interested in what the FBI was learning. And then they dropped the investigation. And I wondered about that. And I have not gotten a full explanation for this, but it's difficult given the First Amendment and the broad warrant of liberty that it awards not just to religions, but to reporters like me, First Amendment. It's difficult to determine what is not a religious practice. For instance, people are, confined and beaten in the clergy of Scientology. Well, and they're impoverished. Well, Franciscan monks are impoverished. They get nothing. And there are, penitents who lacerate themselves. Once you start going down that road about what can be considered a religious practice, it's pretty amazing how broad and pernicious the behaviors are that can be permitted. And I can't imagine that you can sign away your liberty the way that young people routinely do when they join the Sea Org and sign these contracts for 1 billion years of service. But the government is very ill prepared to determine what is exactly a religion. And, the powers are invested in the IRS, which is probably, it's a group of accountants and lawyers. They're not really theologians. So, they do not want to be in the middle of it. All that said, I think that a lot of the practices of Scientology, financially very questionable. That in the 70s, 11 people were rounded up, went to prison for infiltrating and spying on government offices and stealing files. And the IRS was one of those offices they penetrated. And yet, when the IRS was trying to determine whether or not Scientology should have a religious exemption and was very not disposed toward doing that, the agency and individual agents were subject to more than 2,400 lawsuits by the church and individual members, and it just caved in.
That was a fascinating moment. They just terrified the IRS with the threat of, as you say, it was over 2,000 lawsuits, and that was sufficient. The IRS just went away, like, please stop suing us, and we'll no longer look at your taxes.
Yeah, it was. I haven't decided whether I can adopt that strategy next time I get audited.
Maybe if you and I do it together, 2 lawsuits might be enough.
Class. Yeah.
To this point about the Scientology jail, maybe I've forgotten, but I don't recall it being clear to me. Everything you said about this drawing a bright line between religious practice and anything else and what this means from a kind of a law enforcement point of view, it seems to me the golden principle here has got to be consent. Mm-hmm. Consenting adults should be able to do more or less whatever they want unless they're hurting some other non-consenting adults. So, I practice Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. I consent from time to time to let somebody who's better at it strangle me. This would be an assault if I hadn't consented, but because I want to learn jiu-jitsu and I've agreed to put myself in that position, it's fine, and it's actually incredibly fun to do. So the people who were in the jail
It's called the Gold Base, and it's in Hemet, California, in Southern California.
So now, could they have left if they wanted to? Were they just held there by the fear of disconnection from their family and friends, or were they actually imprisoned?
Well, they were actually imprisoned, and some people escaped. And some people escaped and were dragged back. But
how has this not been prosecuted by the government?
There were also people there, and maybe most of them, who, as I was asking that same question to some of the people who had been in the hole, and in their discussions with the FBI wanted to do a raid on the hole. With the hole, by the way, is 2 double-wide trailers that were married together, and more than 100 top-level Scientology executives were confined there, some for a period of years, with no, sleeping on the floor, no furniture, and doing these punishing exercises all day, but spiritual exercises, and being routinely physically abused. And yet, what my sources were telling the FBI, well, if you do break in, everybody in there will just say it's all sunshine and seashells. That's what their quote was. That they were there for their own volition, for their own spiritual advancement. If you harbor thoughts about whether this is doing you any good, and you admit it to somebody, that would rat you out immediately, and the punishment would be even greater. So people kept those thoughts to themselves if they had them, and if they really felt that they had to get out of there, then there were 2 options. One was to try to escape, and it was difficult. They were locked into this hole. Let out once a day for a shower, and the compound has got barbed wire fence with coils of razor wire around it, and it's not easy to get out of there. And even if you do, there was what was called a blow drill. This team of Scientologists there are only a few bus stations it's very, very remote. One highway going through there. It's not easy. They're in a valley of these hills, amply supplied with rattlesnakes and thorns and cactus. And so it's not an easy place to escape. But even if you do escape, they'll follow you. And one guy was picked up. They knew he was a baseball fan, and they found him in the parking lot of San Francisco Giants Stadium. These stories are legend among Scientologists, and it's a real caution for those who would like to escape. There are other The other way, they can go in and say, I want to get out. I'm done here. I'm no longer a Scientologist. Okay, very well. Uh, suppose you join this organization, as a Sea Org member, which is what they call their clergy. Say you joined it when you were 12 years old or 15, and you're now 34 years old. And so for your entire adult life, you have not been educated. You have no job. You have no marketable skills on the outside of the world. That certainly your employer is not going to give you a recommendation. Everybody will no longer talk to you. Your family, your friends, your children, your parents. That no one will ever talk to you again. And then you'll be given a bill for services rendered. You've only been paid $50 a week, so you got no money. But then you'll be given a bill for $50, $100, $200,000 for all this, the lessons that you've taken and so on that were Scientology lessons.
And meanwhile, they have a record of every dark thought you've ever confessed in your auditing sessions.
So, the levers that the church can bring to bear are pretty powerful. And so that's one reason why people stay in the hole, even if the doors were unlocked.
Do you think a similar principle explains Tom Cruise and John Travolta? These are obviously the two most prominent celebrities.
Yeah.
Their continued tenure there, or do you have a sense of their level of actual commitment to the beliefs and the practices? What explains what seems to be a kind of really a shocking level of moral culpability on their parts for propping up this organization? Because it's pretty clear they must know about the whole and the fact that people are paid, 40 cents a day or whatever it is, and not educated, and the whole phenomenon of disconnection and all of the attendant suffering. How do you explain their role here?
Well, I've been very hard on Cruise, especially because I've thought about how could Scientology change. Mormonism survived and is actually seen in a lot of places around the world as being this kind of super American religion, which is ironic given it was so anti-American, and that's what got it in trouble in the first place. But it's totally different religion in many respects, and such that you have Mitt Romney running for president, and his religion is not even much of an issue. So that could happen to Scientology, but it's unlikely to change at all as long as David Miscavige is in total control of the organization. So how could Scientology reform at least its human rights abuses? And one route was, well, the IRS could reconsider its tax exemption, but given how cowed they were by the church and how they utterly collapsed in the face of all those lawsuits, I don't think they've got the stomach to go back to that. And the only other route I could see to enforcing any kind of change would be for some of those celebrities, and especially Tom Cruise, the most notable Scientologist ever, to say it's time for us to make a change, and we need to look at some of the actions that we've taken as an organization and make amends. He's done very much the opposite. So, and why? In a way, what got me interested in Scientology in the first place is that, these are very notable people. They lend their prestige and their names to probably the most stigmatized religion in America today. And I don't think it advances their careers by hardly at all. Very much the opposite. It's people sneer at Scientology. So why do they commit themselves? And I think in the case of celebrities, there are a couple of things going on. One, like many Scientologists, they feel like they've gotten something out of it. And John Travolta, for instance, almost his very first experience as a young actor on a movie set in Mexico, an actress on the set gave him some Scientology treatment, and he went exterior, which is the sense that he had an out of body experience. And then when he got back to L.A. and went to the Celebrity Center for classes, he said he was up for this role in Welcome Back, Kotter. And so the teacher had all the students turn in the direction of the studio and telepathically send this message that John Travolta is right for the role, and he got the role. And so he always attributed that to Scientology. And, I don't know exactly what secrets he may have told in these therapy sessions that are recorded, but I did speak to a Scientologist who said that he had been assigned to assemble all the dark secrets on Travolta just in case he ever tried to break out. And so it could be that that he hasn't left just because what the church might hold on him. On the other hand, he said that when his son died, there's a source of a lot of consolation. So there are a number of considerations with him. With Cruise, he was already a movie star when he was exposed to Scientology, and he claims it helped him with his dyslexia. The way I look at Cruise and some of these other celebrities, people who go into Hollywood, like Tom Cruise, typically do so when they're very young. They drop out of high school, or they just barely graduate, and then they go directly to Hollywood. They have very limited educational achievement, and sometimes they become movie stars right away. Sometimes they eat cat food for 7 years and never go anywhere. And so it's an amazingly big risk that they take. And there's always, I think, among a number of people in Hollywood, a sense of inadequacy, of not knowing very much about the world, and but except for their own world. And Scientology compensates in an amazing way, which is that you don't need to know all that stuff. We will teach you not just how the world works, but how to control other human beings. And we will teach you that, we will demonstrate to you scientifically that you've had past lives. And moreover, we'll give you a mission in life, which is to save the universe. Well, I think those things really reach Tom Cruise. And there's an additional factor that is especially difficult for celebrities, which is the degree of public humiliation they might subject themselves to if they walk away from the church. They walk away realizing, to their shame, that they have given, in many cases, millions of dollars. They've added their name to an organization that has oppressed many parishioners and exploited them. And they, like Tom Cruise, may be responsible for the many people joining the church. And then they are opening themselves to the liability of having all their darkest secrets poured out into the National Enquirer or People magazine or any such source. It's a huge risk.
So has anything like this happened to Paul Haggis? I mean, it seems to me he would be the perfect example of someone who is reasonably prominent and left in a spectacularly adversarial way. He really uncorked this thing, and now he's out there functioning in Hollywood. What's happened to him?
Well, they've attacked him. They've done what they could. He says they went through his trash, and then yet in order to be intimidated by the church, in some ways you have to consent to that, and he simply hasn't consented. He refuses to be intimidated. You can read scurrilous things about him on the internet that the church has put out there. And that's true, of me and everybody else that's come close to the church. But if, with Paul, he's not a movie star. He's a kind of behind the scenes guy. I think that in terms of, he's got a little less to lose. I think, you can look at Leah Remini, for instance, who is a television star. And she's doing this show now in which she's vociferously attacking the church and its practice of disconnection. And, they're certainly after her, but it's apparent she doesn't care. And if you don't care, then the church is really powerless. In the old days, the church would frame people, and that was, I haven't seen that happen in more recent times. But when their critics would go after them, like Paulette Cooper, who wrote one of the very first exposés of the church called "The Scandal of Scientology." I think this was in the 70s. They tried to frame her for threatening attacks on President Ford and on the church itself. And they actually got a grand jury. They were going to get an indictment. They were trying to get her sent to a mental institution. And it wasn't until the FBI broke into Scientology headquarters to round up all the material that had been stolen from the government by Scientologists that they found the actual plans to attack Paulette Cooper. Otherwise, she might have been imprisoned.
Fascinating. This is the point where I become excruciatingly aware of how generous you've been with your time.
Yeah.
But I want to, if you can manage it, I want to touch maybe just for a few minutes on your book, Remembering Satan, because I found that story. I remember reading it as a New Yorker article first, and it's like a twilight zone that you just can't believe has happened. Can you tell that story in broad strokes?
Yeah, back in the 80s, there was what we now understand was a mass hysteria based on what we call recovered memories. And these were memories that oftentimes in therapy, especially young women with eating disorders, would be coaxed into remembering things that they had repressed, according to the therapist. And they would explain why they're dysfunctional now. And the answer for so many of them was that their father had abused them sexually. And in the course of this, some of these memories became, because they weren't accurate, quite extraordinary. And there was a sense that, they had been satanically abused by cults. And I got interested in this when my own therapist said that they were seeing a lot of patients, young women mainly, who were suffering from multiple personality disorder, which was a really rare diagnosis. And that in therapy, they were recovering these memories of these satanic abuses. And my therapist told me that the Satanists were responsible for 50 murders a year in Austin. Well, we've never had that. One year we had 52 murders. That was in 1962 or something like that. But it's never approached that level. But what I have to stress to you, these are really smart, cogent, reliable people. But they were deeply sympathetic to their patients, and they invited me to a workshop for multiple personality. And it was led by these women who said that they had multiple personalities. One of them said she had 300 personalities. What a management problem that posed. And it was bizarre to me because these women were talking about murders that they had witnessed, babies being cut up on them, neighbors being slain. And I thought, well, if people really believe this, why isn't anyone calling the police? And then I went to a workshop for cops that was led by a cop who was a national authority on satanic abuse. And he said that Satanists were responsible for 50,000 murders in the U.S. every year. Well, we've never had that many murders, in the U.S. And these were cops. And I thought, what is going on? So I went to my editor at the time, Tina Brown, and I said I was interested in writing about multiple personality. And she, and I said, well, when they explore these in therapy with these young women, they often have these memories of satanic abuse. And, oh, that's hot. She loves that. So I went into this. I always try to go into it with a kind of studied neutrality,
Hmm.
to see, do not form your opinion until you have encountered, the evidence. And there were already hundreds of cases around the country in courts and in charges in police stations about satanic abuse, and it was all over the daytime talk shows, and it was a nationwide phenomenon.
Also, there had been the McMartin preschool trial
Yeah,
then,
the
right?
daycare cases, there were a number of them. There was a corollary action going on, and so I started researching, uh, and I found this one case in Olympia, Washington, where a man confessed. He was a deputy sheriff, Paul Ingram. He confessed to abusing his daughters, and they had accused him of these sexual satanic crimes. And I thought, well, if there's any truth to it, then this would be the case that proves that satanic ritual abuse really exists. So that was the case that I decided to profile. And what I found is that Ingram was a Pentecostal churchgoer. His pastor came into the jail, his own jail, where he was being incarcerated, and told him that God would not permit any false memories to come into his mind. And then a psychologist came in and hypnotized him, and he began having these vivid, extraordinary visions of satanic ritual parties where they abused his daughters and his wife and so on. And the girls began having more and more elaborate thoughts, but their memories and their father's memories never coincided. So it was very frustrating to the investigators. And the girls talked about having been nailed to the floor and raped, and they gave birth to these babies that were sacrificed, and it was an unbelievable story. And then Paul, because he confessed, he went to prison for it.
And then implicating others. Didn't he have like a poker game or something where the other men were implicated?
Yes, and that was there's in the craft of writing, there's one little trick that I love, that a friend of mine taught me, called the rubber band theory, which is that when you plant an idea, question in the reader's mind, you don't answer it right away. You tease it out, and the more tension that builds up, the more pleasure the reader gets when the question is answered. Mm-hmm. And so Jim Raby was the name of one of Paul Ingram's colleagues in the sheriff's department in Thurston County. And the girls and Paul implicated him as one of the Satanists who had been doing the abusing. And he was, upset and jailed, and he demanded a polygraph, and he failed the test. And this was a 2-part New Yorker story. And I left the New Yorker readers hanging for a week, wondering, if this was really true.
Right.
But I had another polygraph administered to him, in which he passed with flying colors. But it turned out later that the girls they were still virgins. There were no scars on their bodies. There was no evidence to back up any of these fabulous visions. And yet Paul Ingram served 18 years and for a crime that he never committed, only one that he remembered.
Wasn't there a moment, forgive me, it's been a long time since I read this, but wasn't there a moment once he was imprisoned where it actually became like a proper Twilight Zone, because either you or the investigators, someone went to Ingram with facts that they knew were false because they had made them up.
Yeah.
And pinged him about these memories. Like, your son said there was another thing that happened with a horse or whatever it was, which they just made up. And Ingram said, oh, yeah, that did happen.
Yeah.
Like he just proved to be the most suggestible person on earth.
There was, how suggestible people are is very interesting to me. I used to be very interested in hypnotism. And I was probably a dangerous eighth grader. I went through the abnormal psychology shelf of our public library and learned how to hypnotize my sisters. But the fact that you can actually plant ideas in people's minds. There was a case that I read about when I was doing research for that book. This is totally unethical on the part of the therapist, and it wouldn't, I think, be allowed to be done now. But he hypnotized one of his patients, and he told her under hypnosis that she came late, which wasn't true, and he wanted to know why she was running late. And so she said, "Well, I was driving along the highway, and I saw a cow, and it was trying to give birth. And so I crossed the fence, and I was trying to help the cow. And then suddenly the therapist said, and a light appeared above." And those are the only two things he said. You were late, and a light appeared above. And suddenly it was a UFO that was descending and took her up. And, so she had this extremely vivid UFO delusion. And when the therapist awakened her, he told her what she had said, and he said, "Now this did not happen. This was not true." But it was weeks before she could shake off the sense of reality that it actually had happened. And so I think there's a commonality between all these UFO things and the hysteria about Satanism and the daycare things. All of something was cooking in our culture. It made a deep impression on me on how susceptible all of us are to the suggestions that other people put into our minds.
Yeah, well, this obviously ties back nicely to the fake news phenomenon we were talking about earlier in the conspiracy theories. Are you familiar with the book, the 19th century book, Extraordinary Popular Delusions and the Madness of Crowds by Charles Mackay?
Yeah,
because there's a section there on the witch mania in Europe, which I just recorded an audiobook edition of just that chapter, but it's exactly the same phenomenon that you describe in the Ingram household. I mean, you have these hysterical young women just kind of broadcasting whatever psychopathology is going on in the family into this confabulatory act of imagination. And it's happening in the context of a religious world where more or less everyone in sight shares a religious worldview that the devil's real and walks the earth, right? So of course he's going to come and tempt somebody sometime. If I recall, not only did the family share this worldview, but some number of the cops who were investigating the crime.
Absolutely, yeah. And that the thing that's surprising, but I think a lesson you have to learn from this, the demand that the people who claim to be victims, their great demand was believe us. If you don't believe us, you are re-abusing us.
Right.
And of course, the therapists and the cops are helpers. Their goal is to protect the victims and, take care of them. And so they're naturally drawn to try to help anybody that's in such distress. And the distress appeared real. I mean, I think the distress was real. It's just that the cause of the distress wasn't real. And it caused them to suspend their rational judgment of what was actually going on. Because if you thought about it critically, then in some ways you were betraying the trust that this victim has demanded.
And also, I think just to spare ourselves a lot of pain on Twitter, we should make it clear that we are not disputing the fact that somebody somewhere gets raped by her father. And
absolutely.
And in fact, even in this case, if I recall, there was some real dysfunction in the house. I think the brothers were having sex with the sisters or something, right?
It may have been true. That was the first allegation by and there was no satanic coloration to it.
Right.
But one of the consequences of this is that young women who may not have been abused, but had these extravagant visions, were in some ways deprecating people who had real experiences that weren't nearly as elaborate or fanciful, and colorful. And so I talked to women who had been in therapy groups with people who said that they'd been satanically abused, and they felt totally cut out of the conversation and overwhelmed. And so, in a way, they were really victimized by this.
Hmm. Okay, Lawrence, a final, very brief question, but I have to ask it because I've been thinking about broadening the range of my podcast guests, and just out of nowhere, I had the idea that I could go to the Supermax prison in Florence, Colorado, and interview the Unabomber about his anti-technology manifesto. And I was wondering just, how one did that and if that was possible, if he had done any interviews in the past. And then I saw that he reached out to you, the one journalist on earth he would want to talk to, and that you showed no interest at all in talking to him. So tell me why, given the breadth of your interests and the kinds of people you engage, why you would have no interest in interviewing Ted Kaczynski.
Well, it's not true that I would have no interest in it. If it looked like a real letter to me. I have no idea why anybody would fake it, but so I did respond to him and never got a reply. But there was a time when I was interested in writing about really heinous criminals to try to get a sense of what's going on in their mind that causes them to do the things they do. And I don't think I had written to Kaczynski, but Hinckley and others that assassins and so on. I had, and all that stuff comes up in freedom of information stuff. So I got sort of jeered at by the Washington Post media guy when he found all these letters that I'd written.
Right.
But the truth is, you really can't get into Supermax. I wanted to talk to Ramzi Youssef and Omar Abdul Rahman, who are both in Florence, and I just couldn't get any traction. You might have more luck than I, but they, for the most part, you have to be a family member or you have to have some kind of sanction. Normally, when you want to talk to a prisoner, you get their lawyer to help you out, and that's. But as far as you actually getting into Supermax in order to talk to them, that's a challenge.
Well, listen, Lawrence, it's been absolutely fascinating.